Hello, people of grace. For our worship segment this morning, we are looking at Daniel chapter 3, which is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. Or if you're a parent with kids of my generation, uh, the VeggieTales Rack, Shack, and Benny story. So, what we have in Daniel 3, and many of you are very familiar with this story, is Nebuchadnezzar having just had a dream interpreted by Daniel, and having Daniel and the three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, exalted to positions of influence. Now in chapter 3, you see time has gone by and Nebuchadnezzar has fallen back into his old ways. And he has this statue built, which was probably not a statue the way we think of a Greco-Roman statue, but more of a very tall pillar or prism, and then maybe at the top some engravings and a carving of Nebuchadnezzar. And then Nebuchadnezzar turns around and he summons from all over the kingdom of Babylon these governors and satraps and all these different officials, and brings them in to practice this form of loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar by bowing down to the statue and worshiping the statue. Just a quick footnote on a technical point related to Daniel. Daniel is a book that's very much attacked in critical circles related to the scriptures because his prophecies are so specific that many would argue that the book must have been written later. There's several evidences that would suggest that that's a bad position to take, but one of those evidences is right in these verses, because this section of the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic, and the titles given to these officials, so far we've never found the words used for these officials except in ancient Aramaic manuscripts dated to the 6th and 5th centuries BC, which is right when Daniel would have lived. So there's a little piece of evidence that argues for the authenticity of the book. A few of the titles in there are Aramaic phrases that date to the 6th and 5th centuries BC, which would argue that this is a contemporaneous account of the events. So anyway, come back to the main point of the story. Daniel is apparently away, probably on government business somewhere. He's not caught up in this. He's not ordered to bow. He's not taken into this situation. But much of the Congress, so to speak, has been summoned and is being ordered to bow. So it's really a power play by Nebuchadnezzar as a tyrant to set up a one-party state and make sure that everybody swears loyalty to him and worships him. And that's the scenario, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are caught up in that. They get someone that's very admired because Nebuchadnezzar had achieved a level of prosperity that was not known of in the history of the world up to that point. Daniel calls him the King of Kings in the previous chapter, that God has blessed Nebuchadnezzar so richly. But he's taking it too far, and he makes this statue to himself. Bad idea. When we make statues to people, eventually people resent those statues because the people they're made to have flaws. We probably shouldn't go down that road, but we do as human beings, and we're doing it in our own nation. We're facing challenges to this day, and very relevant in the United States today. So take what we're dealing with in the United States today and raise it up quite a few levels, because these statues are just not dedicated to people, but declaring that this person is a god and needs to be worshipped. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego can't do that. And they conscientiously object, and then the Magi, or some of your translations may say the Chaldeans, the astrologers, who are part of this administrative state of governors and satraps and everything, they pounce and they make sure that Nebuchadnezzar is aware that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will not bow. And that moves us in from verses 1 through 7 that talk about the statue. Verses 8 through 12 talk about the Magi coming in and trying to use force to impose right thinking and right belief. And that gets Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in trouble. So just to kind of capture that up to this point, Nebuchadnezzar is trying to impose a one-party state ideology religion. You can worship whatever gods you want, but you must bow down to him. Christians ran into that with some of the Roman emperors up into our New Testament era. But here's where it gets scary is if you don't line up with the right ideology according to the dominant political power of your day, then force will be used against you. And the Magi come in and make sure that the power of the state is directed to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to force belief onto them. And whenever that happens, that's really evil. Yeah. And sometimes the church has fallen into that and tried to use the power of the state to impose its beliefs on people that don't agree with those beliefs. And that's evil. That's wrong. And the Magi try to use the power of the state to force Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to bow. And that creates a big problem. So, a little interruption there. Because they're not going to bow. And they are brought before the king, and they're very clear. The king threatens them, again, with his executive power to put them to death, and they don't back down at all. The king gets very angry in verses 13 through 15. And then you get this response from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I do want to read these few verses because they're so powerful. It says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. That's not them being disrespectful. When they say we have no need to answer, there's no explanation that they can give. Technically, they're guilty. They're disobeying the law. And there's not really any way to get around that. Nebuchadnezzar has just said, what God can save you from my hand? And if he's determined to throw them into the fiery furnace, they say this, if this be so, that you're going to throw us into the fiery furnace, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So that's not many words, but there's a lot of meaning packed into that. Nebuchadnezzar, you just said, what God can save you from me? And they come back very strongly and say, our God is completely able to save us from you. But we don't know whether he will or not in the sense of saving us from death. So they say, he is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. So what they qualify is he is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. One way or the other, we will be delivered from your power, O king, because either we will be delivered from the fiery furnace or we will die and we will be outside of your reach. And then they come back with this. But if not, if he doesn't deliver us from the fiery furnace and we die, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And then you get Nebuchadnezzar flying into his rage again. He was extremely angry before, but this exchange, I think, actually shows some hesitancy on Nebuchadnezzar's part. Nebuchadnezzar knows these three people. They have had great favor in his eyes, and he definitely knows Daniel, who is kind of his right-hand man. And Daniel's not involved in this case, but Daniel's Nebuchadnezzar's friend. And Nebuchadnezzar probably hesitates a little bit, but when they give this response, verse 19 says, then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury again, and the expression of his face changed. So whatever sympathies he had for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're gone. He hardens his heart, as Pharaoh so often hardened his heart. And he actually orders the furnace to be heated sevenfold, probably a poetic statement, but it was heated up to a deadly level, And he orders Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be thrown in. And the furnace was so deadly that even some of the guards who got close to the furnace perished. But then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get thrown into the furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar reacts in shock, because as he's looking at this, he doesn't see three figures, he sees four. God does choose to intervene, either the second person of the Trinity, Jesus himself, or an angel. Nebuchadnezzar says he looks like a son of the gods. But this spirit being comes in and protects Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they were bound and thrown into the furnace, but then Nebuchadnezzar orders the furnace to be opened, and they walk out. They're not bound. There's not even a smell of smoke on them or fire. Their clothes are unharmed. Their hair is fine. And Nebuchadnezzar humbles himself in the presence of this. And he's astonished and amazed. But then he says, "Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb." Nebuchadnezzar is a gentle guy, right? "And their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." So Nebuchadnezzar isn't renouncing all other gods, but he is starting to process through something about that this God of Daniel from chapter 2, this God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is stronger than the other gods. And what you have is the beginning of an understanding that the Creator, Yahweh, the God of the Bible, is not just another spirit being. He is the Creator. And from humanity's point of view, at this stage in history, the God of Israel is just one of the gods, but there are others. And that's actually true if we go with their understanding of gods, which is these spirit beings that do influence human affairs. But like Egypt, where the plagues and Moses' power ultimately show that the God of Israel is above these other spirit beings, the same thing's happening here. It really is a warfare among the gods, and our God is greater. And he decides when to intervene or when not to intervene. Our responsibility is to trust him and to obey him. So in this case, God intervenes and Babylon gets better. But if God had chosen not to intervene, then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get better because they get delivered to heaven. This is how God works. This is the way Paul talks in Philippians 1 when he's in prison. He's awaiting trial. He's not sure if he's going to be released or put to death. And he says, "Well, I desire to remain and be present in the body, which gives me an opportunity for more labor. But I also long to depart and be with the Lord, which is better by far." And then he says, "So whatever happens to me, whether he is put to death or whether he is freed and allowed to remain in the world longer," he says to the Philippians, "You conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel." So that's the story. There's a couple points I want to make from that, and then try to use the story to help you see a pattern, a really big pattern of life. If we take the points of the story and bring it into today's context, what Nebuchadnezzar is doing, and I've already alluded to this, is he's trying to make everyone in the government, everybody who has a governmental position, kind of toe the party line and worship him as a god. He's setting up a totalitarian one-party state. And he's saying, "I'm not just ordering you to do this, I will use force if you don't bow down and toe the party line." This is an important lesson for Christians because we've got evangelical Christians who are all over the place politically. And that's good because it's not a one-party system. We probably need more political parties. We're kind of dominated by two. But apart from that political element, here's my challenge for you. Christians keep getting pulled into political parties, whichever one you're part of. And then they feel like, even when that party is doing things that are not right, that they have to toe the party line. Not because they're going to be killed if they don't, though that day might come, but because they'll lose power if they don't. And it's just such a upside down, backwards, terrible way to think as a follower of God. We can't let politics and trying to grab political power cause us to lose our prophetic voice. And so if you are aligned more with the Democratic Party and you are a Christian, you need to renounce certain aspects of the way the Democratic Party operates. And if you do that, you will probably be cast aside. But the same thing's true for so many of us, especially white evangelicals who have just aligned with the Republican Party, but overlook clear problems in today's Republican Party. Because if we speak to that and say, we will not bow, we will not pull the lever on that point, then we lose power. But have we lost power? I think we're hanging on the worldly power and losing our spiritual voice. We need to be Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and speak the truth to whatever party we are being pulled into. They were being pulled into this situation in Babylon, and not so much worry about some party that we're not part of. So this is just another way of saying, can we start with the beam in our own eye and not get so hung up on worldly power? The church had its biggest impact on the powers of its day in the first 300 years of the church's existence when it had no political power. It just maintained its prophetic voice. And that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do. And they are being threatened with force. And when they refuse to bow, they face a lot of anger. They face a lot of indignation. They are rebuked publicly. And anger and indignation by the people who are spewing it at you, they always think they're righteous. Because nobody says, yeah, I'm wrong and I'm angry and now I'm going to take you down over it. They claim a moral high ground. So it's hard to face anger and indignation because with that anger and indignation that's now directed at you, there's a presumption from those people that you are the bad guy. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't the bad guy. They were just standing on the principles of their faith. And they didn't give in. And then the anger gets amped up. This is anger, this is indignation, but it's not righteous anger. It just claims it is. And Nebuchadnezzar does have some human loyalties and some beginnings of faith and hope and love. And he is hesitant in this passage, but then he hardens his heart. And you're going to see more about Nebuchadnezzar as we continue through Daniel. In this case, God chose to intervene and extend Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's days. But that sense of political force to impose an ideology, and the Christians need to be willing to stand against that, even if you lose power, even if you lose your life. Not exchange your spiritual voice for political influence. And definitely don't silence your voice just to save yourself. Speak up. We have to keep speaking. We're called to that. So that's the story. But then in this story, you see a divine pattern. And you see this multiple times in Scripture. You see this with Joseph several times. You see it with Daniel a couple times in this book. You see it with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego here. You see it with Esther. You see it with humanity. And this is the pattern. The protagonist, in this case, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but it could be Joseph, it could be Esther, it could be Daniel, it could be Jesus, it could be Adam and Eve. The protagonists are in this place of prosperity. They are loved. They are being heard. They're in a good place. And then they enter into a time of danger. And they're threatened. And often it's by an evil conspiracy. With Joseph, it could have been his brothers, or then Potiphar's wife. Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you see this here. With Esther, there's Haman. But ultimately, there's a predator that comes in and threatens their prosperity and their blessing. In the Garden of Eden, it was Satan himself. And with Jesus, it's Satan and the religious rulers. The predators come in and threaten the protagonist's prosperity. So you have creation in prosperity. You have a predator or predators and a threat. And then you have the fall, whether the protagonist sins themselves or whether they just end up being persecuted. The protagonist is condemned to death or prison or some type of punishment because they broke the law. The law might have been righteous, the law might have been unrighteous. Here, the law is unrighteous. But the protagonist, in the face of this predator that they may be aware of, they may not be aware of, their prosperity is threatened and they break the law and they're put under the sentence of death or prison. Then, by the lawgiver himself, they are redeemed out of prison and ultimately exalted to a position of honor. So what you see in this is creation and prosperity, a predator and a threat, a fall and being put under the bondage of death and prison, a redemption where the lawgiver himself comes in and redeems and then exalts them, a glorification. So creation, fall, redemption. But between creation and the fall, you have a predator or predators. And then from the fall and redemption, you get a glorification. This is how God works. And this is how he will work in your life. You may face a situation at work where you've been put into a position of prosperity, and then something happens where you have to speak up, or you have to say, I can't do that. Maybe it's a coworker who's conspiring to undo you, a predator coming in. And then you are threatened with a demotion or not getting a promotion or maybe even losing your position. What are you going to do? What am I going to do? What is the challenge? We have to be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and say, well, God can work this out at this job, in this scenario, whatever it is. But if he doesn't and I lose everything, I'm trusting God to eventually lift me up in his time. And so that's kind of the pattern for us. And you'll see that in the notes that I send along with this message. But the battle for faith comes in when the predator strikes, and the ultimate predator is the devil. And when we are now in a time of a fall, whether because we messed up or just because we're being persecuted, and we're no longer in a place of prosperity, and our back's against the wall, and we're feeling threatened, and we're feeling vulnerable, will we keep faith? That's the turning point. Jesus kept faith. Ultimately, in the Bible, the protagonist is God, but in many ways humanity. But here's how God pulls it together. God becomes human. What is man? What is humanity? That God is so mindful of us. In the incarnation, we see the ultimate creator facing the ultimate predator. The creator falls. The creator is redeemed from that fall. He's exalted. He falls not in that he sins. He falls in that he takes our sin on himself and he suffers and dies. He is delivered through death, from death, and now glorified to the highest place. This is the pattern. Faith is about not demanding that you be delivered and glorified on this side of the grave. Jesus wasn't delivered and glorified on this side of the grave. If our faith demands restoration and glorification on this side of the grave, it's an insufficient faith, and it's not a deep enough faith to really change the world. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego changed their world because they didn't need to be delivered on this side of the grave. There's a lot that relates to going on in our world today, and it really is a battle for faith. Let's have a faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, of Daniel, of Esther. Let's fulfill that pattern in our lives, because ultimately we're not looking at these people. We're looking to Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith. I hope that encourages you. Have a blessed day.